Apologies. Just again to introduce myself, Professor Vogel from Wits University, and I'm the facilitator of this session. Just to explain the program briefly, there will be inputs from this very esteemed panel here, and then we're going to talk to our other country representatives from the BRICS countries who will also be making inputs. So there's two components to this panel. The panel is essentially dealing with the following sub-themes, if I can just read them out briefly. Lessons learned from coordination of the national states of disaster, followed by impact-based early warning systems to improve early action, followed by then data and information during disasters. What might a data observatory look like? Followed then by building resilient infrastructure in the aftermath of a disaster, then turning our attention to funding mechanisms for recovery and rehabilitation, and finally, but not least, going into the integrated and coherent planning, which was raised as a question just prior to us breaking for tea. The panel will be coming and giving their inputs. We will also have time for questions right at the end. And unfortunately, the video that was going to be shown, I've been instructed to let us show that later. There is apparently another video, so apologies to all that the video that was intended to be shown got shifted a bit, but that was also owing to delays in us starting. So without further ado, I'd like to call up Anne Bruver. Well, she's sitting there. We're not going to come up to this mic. We're going to make it more of a dialogue and interactive. So if I can just give you a little bit of background to Anne. Anne has in excess of 30 years of experience in a government environment where she's made a measurable impact in advancing the implementation of disaster management. She's spearheaded amendments of the Disaster Management Act. She's been working on policies, on guidelines, and on standards. So she's very well placed to take us through some of the lessons learned from her perspective and from the colleagues that she engages with. So over to Anne. Thank you.
Lean? I don't need to switch on.
Can I ask the technician, can you hear?
Yes, I'm audible now. Thank you very much, Colleen, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. There's a saying that goes, in the midst of every disaster lies great opportunity. To benefit from such opportunity, it is critical for all of those involved in the disaster management discourse to engage in a process of honest and transparent reflection, or as an after-action review to identify areas of lessons learned and areas of improvement. South Africa also conducted after-action reviews for the COVID-19 and also the flood disasters that we experienced more recently. And those that have devastated such a large number of our communities. The essence of the question posed today is which of these identified lessons are critical to advance coordinated multi-hazard risk management. So in view of time constraints, but also effectiveness, I want to apply the Pareto principle, where 80% of the required outcomes needed can be achieved by taking 20% of action. So instead of taking 30 minutes, I'll take 6, and instead of 30 areas of focus, I'll highlight 6 areas. So based on this premise, I will also highlight a few key lessons, which I believe is critical to advance coordinated multi-hazard risk management. The first and utmost, from my experience when we were in South Africa, when we had to deal with COVID-19 and the flood disasters, is that and organizations. I would argue that the institutional architecture for handling these events were put in place quite quickly through cabinet structures to specifically coordinate a multi-agency approach from national level to local levels. Well-defined legal and policy are also essential for disaster response, and the Disaster Management Act of South Africa proved its mettle throughout these disasters that we had to manage. In managing and coordinating these disasters, the National Disaster Management Centre also executed its legislative obligations by activating coordination structures and facilitating the promotion of integrated and coordinated system of disaster management among national, provincial and local governments, but also other stakeholders and communities and functionaries that deal with disaster management issues. So I believe when the public sees clear leadership and a coordinated response, it instills confidence and trust in the authorities. This can help prevent panic and disorder and also assist in implementing measures required to deal with the disaster. Effective leadership practices that must be exercised during times of adversity and crisis includes things like offering decisiveness in decision-making, conveying resilience and confidence, providing hope and vision, retaining and building credibility and trustworthiness, and communicating constantly. I think every South African can recall the so-called family meetings during COVID times when the president addressed the nation on regular interviews, which was often on a Sunday evening. To effectively manage a crisis, a country needs political leaders with the moral authority to mobilize government and societal responses. Also, national leaders plan, mobilize resources, coordinate and ensure implementation. And of course, leaders in science with the credibility to advise government and persuade society at large. So the second area that I would like to highlight is interagency collaboration. Effective coordination involves collaboration among various government agencies, the NGOs, community organizations, and also international partners, including our BRICS counterparts. There is certainly merit in the statement that says, teamwork divides the tasks and multiplies the success. It emphasizes that individual efforts may be limited, but when different agencies work together harmoniously, their collective impact is immensely powerful in mitigating and responding to complex disasters and emergencies. It is, however, important that clear protocols and communication channels should be established. Effective coordination and collaboration in times of crisis is essential for optimizing resources, minimizing confusion, and of course, saving lives. Effective communications is key, both internally among agencies and externally with the public. Timely and accurate information sharing reduces confusion and joint coordinates or task teams to coordinate the responses to these disasters. We had task teams for medical and health, for security, for communication, infrastructure interventions, amongst other things. So this is very closely related to the third area that I want to highlight, which is effective functioning of disaster management centers, and specifically disaster operations centers across the spheres of government. This is where representatives of organs of state are brought together in a centralized location to analyze disaster needs and develop and implement incident action plans in an integrated manner. And this will be a key accelerant of providing disaster relief. Investing in the capacity of these centers are key to achieve success and maintain momentum and develop expertise in the long run. The disasters that we experienced in South Africa demonstrated both effective it structures the government countries really is a need for an overall system going forward. This brings me to the importance of mainstreaming disaster management and disaster risk reduction. Deepening the institutionalization of the disaster management function in organs of state across the three spheres of government improves the capacity to plan, prevent, mitigate, prepare, respond, and recover from disasters, using disaster management plans in all organs of state that are implemented and integrated. So these things need to happen prior disasters. So it is very important that this becomes part of your day-to-day business. So effective recovery from disasters in future requires a resilient disaster management system with well-capacitated disaster management centers in the various spheres and sectors to lead to an effective disaster management response. The fifth area is about early warning and early action. And I think some of the previous speakers have also already alluded to that in earlier sessions. So taking early action when early warnings are issued provides the best opportunity to minimize the impact of disasters. Robust early warning systems are vital for timely evacuation and responses. This includes monitoring systems for various hazards and mechanisms to communicate warnings to the public. Developing early warning systems to activate localized early action, especially when taken by a community, is a powerful multiplier of capacity and have been proven to save lives. Communities should be actively involved in disaster preparedness and response. They often have valuable local knowledge and resources that can also complement government efforts. Advances in cellular technologies pave the way for early warnings to reach communities faster and more effectively. And messages and video instructions can benefit all and ultimately save lives. So the last area that I briefly touch on, and that is the sixth one, is the area of information management and automation of data. So the automation of data collection, geographical mapping, business intelligence systems, etc., linked to the planning, budgeting, and implementation can actually be very effective in dealing with disasters and improving relief. By centralizing the disaster management information system and allowing sectors and spheres to share and access this information, allows for better analysis of cross-sectoral issues that leads to collaborative efforts and improved decision-making. So in summary, coordinated multi-hazard disaster preparedness and response requires a holistic approach that encompasses clear leadership and governance, interagency collaboration, effective functioning of disaster management centers, mainstreaming of disaster risk reduction, early warning, early action, and information management and automation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you hear me or not? Now? Can you hear me? Good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anne. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you. I have been advised that
我们现在应该邀请呢金砖国家的代表们上到台上来，Alias Manula， 还有 Serati， 请大家上台来，还有来自中国的也请上台。我希望我是在叫正确的人。最后一个呢是来自印度的，在线上，他呢会给我们自我介绍。好，请大家上台。好的，我们有一个我们如何来这个通过力来减轻自然的影响，这早期的行有影响社区的这个生活呢是 早期预警系统在5年内行动采取一致的措施。我现在呢有介绍呢 s h e p m g o n i 他呢是关于这个也是南非气象局，包括它只给予影响的这个预警然后呢如何改善早期的一些行动，然后呢如何来保障社区的生活和生计，现在先交给Cipo。那个没有讲话的把这个话筒呢关掉。我也提醒一下中国代表，把你们的话筒关掉。我们现在听不到这个声音了。
The interpreters cannot hear what is going
weather-related disasters. And in addition, the effects of climate change are such that there is an expected increase in the intensity of the weather events, especially the severe weather events. Therefore, it's very much important for people to closely monitor all weather-related warnings and to take precautionary measures ahead of anticipated events. In the past decade, South Africa and other global countries, we have faced increased exposure to large-scale disasters, which are driven by both changing nature of hazard and climate variability. While various governments have been able to respond to disasters with the required means, many are still feeling the need to capitalize on lessons learned from the previous events. The recent large-scale KZN floods events of April and also subsequent floods events of May 2022 that claim more than 500 lives provide an indication that more must be done to capacitate our disaster management and early warning system at all levels, including at disadvantaged poor communities, because those are the much affected. The recently developed impact-based forecasting early warning system, which was, of course, developed by South African Weather Service, which worked closely in collaboration with Disaster Management Center at the national level and also with the assistance from UK Met Office, but we also had assistance from various stakeholders. This system provides a new way of issuing early warning for South African communities. It signals a movement from the traditional. I'm not talking about the traditional. I heard that there was earlier question about the tradition, but from South African weather perspective, we used to issue warnings in terms of only the threshold. For example, will be 60%. We'll be saying 60% chance of weather. But now with the new impact-based forecasting system, we filter in the vulnerability because now that is why National Disaster Management Center, it was important because they are the custodian of vulnerability. So we filter in vulnerability and we also filter in the possible impact, possible associated impact. Meaning when we issue a warning now, we'll issue it in terms of the level, maybe level 5, level 6, up to level 10. I remember that the KZN floods, we have issued level 9 and level 10 respectively. But we also communicate the possible impact associated with that, as opposed to previously we'll be saying 80% chances of rain with the possibility of thunderstorms. Prior to impact-based implementation, South African Weather Service, SOurce, and NDMC held various stakeholder meetings and workshops, followed by piloting in various geographical areas using the real case studies. Recently declared disasters highlight the plight of vulnerable rural and peri-urban areas in South Africa and impact-based. Moving into the future, the impact-based warning system is poised to be continuously improved according to global standard. Although we are one of the first we are amongst the first in the world to introduce the impact-based forecasting, but the continuous improvement is necessary. The immediate goal between us and NDMC, especially in 2023-2024 financial year, is to develop the internal standard operating processes for disaster managers at district level. Disaster management entities will therefore have an integrated time-based procedure to respond and escalate operation based on the warnings levels. This will ensure that all spheres of government and civil organization work in coordinated manner. In practice, this will lead to early action of response, thus ensuring the safeguarding of life and properties. We've already started together with NDMC, so we'll be going to different provinces, but we are targeting the district because basically all what we want to do, we want to make sure that each and every district is on the same level and they've got sort of similar protocol that they can follow during disasters. is led by NDMC, also under the leadership of one of its director, Mr. Deglen, that I'm working close with to develop the system. The main objective of the sub-theme that I'm presenting, which is impact-based early warning to improve early action, networking and collaboration amongst government agencies, academic and research institutions, NGOs, insurance institutions, and civil societies. The engagement also aimed to provide insight into the following: how BRICS nations can learn from each other to improve the early warning practices and disaster management systems, and also the role of technology and the real-time warning for developing countries. And also, how can we enhance our existing capabilities for overall improvements and better response? And lastly, how can we improve the information network to strengthen the BRICS nations? And in closing, the lesson learned from the phased approach in developing the impact-based early warning system, the development of national systems which required a highly coordinated and funded approach with the ability to seek guidance from different sectoral areas and disaster management structure. The infusion of international best practices standard for early warning is often prohibited by the governance and funding arrangement, and proactive solution in this regard will allow in-country system to have a shorter and more productive development life cycle. And also, strengthening of non-governmental structure is still essential for early warning practices. Common technology adoption platforms are key to the development of early warning systems. Supplementing various forms of remote sensing into early warning systems allow the broadening of the current system into multi-hazard approach. The risk-based information is key also to early warning information. And lastly, training, development, and education at all levels shorten the time to adopt and use the system of this nature. Thank you.
Sorry about jumping up and down. Thank you very, very much, Shepo. And it was really interesting to hear all the developments and the lead that South Africa is playing, but the call to be working in partnership, I think, is really critical with our BRICS colleagues. It segues nicely into the next presentation, which is going to be on data and information. I think the previous speaker made the comment that we need to, and we're working on getting some coherence in our data. We need to get not only data, but make sure that it's usable and that it is matchable, if you like. So it's with great pleasure I introduce Mr. Abdul Baba, Chief Technology and Information Officer. He's been telling us a whole lot of interesting things over breakfast and on the walk here, so I'm going to not steal his thunder. Unfortunately, you do have to come up to the microphone now, so if you could please come forward, and apologies for that change. Thanks, Abdul.
Sure. All right. Okay, thank you, Chair. And let's switch this one off here. Just want to make sure it's switched off. There we go. Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start to talk a little bit about technology and the role of technology, which really is a critical success factor to ensure successful disaster management, both from a preparation perspective as well as from a response perspective. When we talk about technology, we're not only talking about systems, we're talking about tools that will help us to move quickly. The main purpose of technology, let me just talk a little bit about it, is to predict in such a way that it minimizes the hazards and it helps the reduction in vulnerability, achieving risk reduction. As part and before the disaster management process, with technological innovation, it's bringing digital solutions to sectors that have previously lacked access to technology, including the nonprofit community. The rapid pace of change suggests that one technological most meaningful benefits for society may lie in the humanitarian sector, which must reach large numbers of people in remote and dangerous locations to provide critical resources fast and efficiently. From aerial robotics to big data analytics, technology presents an opportunity to expedite and magnify the impact of humanitarian relief efforts through greater efficiency and responsiveness, reaching more people sooner, mostly cost effectively, and saving more lives. From a technology perspective, there are 4 ways that really contribute the disaster management process. As we see it, technology can go where people cannot and where rescue efforts put the lives of responders at risk. And this is quite clear in terms of drones, aerial robotics, that can actually go into areas that cannot be done from a human perspective. The second one is technology breaks down barriers to enable connectivity where we need it the most. And I think that's quite clear in certain of the earthquakes. We can see that where technology is used for communication purposes. The third one, where India had a lot of climate issues and disasters, where Twitter was used as an enable mechanism to actually ask for help, is mobile solutions, social media, and digital communications provides a new way for organizations and their beneficiaries to communicate. But what I want to do is actually go through the last one, which is very critical. It's the next revolution of big data and artificial intelligence. Vast amounts of data are created during times of disaster, including personal and medical data, the geolocation of roads, tracking of survivors, and more. Managing this data presents challenges, but when effectively employed, it provides crucial information on which to act, prioritize, optimize response efforts, and via crowdsourcing enhances situational awareness. So let me take a step back in terms of where are we? We have early warning systems. We have multiple systems where we need to have capabilities in one place. Big data platforms allows everything in one place with a single view, integrating information at one point so we can actually see at a GIS location where things are from infrastructure mapping, using impact analysis, and using dashboards to actually see what's happening. So at the moment, the major focus really as an enabler into fourth industrial revolution is to ensure that we have our data correct. We have an owner of the data, knowing where the data is, knowing our infrastructure, where exactly the point of contact is at the moment, and how we're going to respond. So the challenge that we currently have now is how do we integrate the data? How do we create a single view of information, taking data, using data in one point at the time we need the information from? If you look at some of the BRICS countries, they are very advanced in what they've invested in their data. Putting best practice data in place, meaning knowing where the data is, having a single view database, knowing exactly how to provide accurate information, and that's critical. The fuel for artificial intelligence is accurate data. If we can't provide accurate data, we don't have data ownership, we can't bring things together, we cannot report immediately on real-time analytics. If you look at the challenges currently, how BRICS nations can actually work together, and if you look at working globally, some of the aspects is about creating a global repository around different standards, around different applications. So if we have one repository, we can learn from different scenarios, different climate, different disasters. It allows lessons learned of using these disruptive technologies through the process. The problem as well is how do we all provide reach of these digital technologies, and how do we provide standards? The second one that we can really work towards is partnerships. How do we work with the private sector and academia to actually utilize some of the solutions that have been developed, and how do we adopt that in different countries? We'll have different scenarios where we have to adopt this technology, but in different cases, all our countries have different aspects around how do we go into the countries and how do we adopt this disaster management process. From a training perspective, we also need to look at how do we train this disruptive technology. How do we also look at the legal ramifications? If we look at some of the technology research, for example, data regulation, how do we manage the regulation of drones? Also in terms of adequate capacity in terms of the skill set. How do we ensure that we provide the skill set to actually provide the implementation of this technology within the disaster management process? If you look at the alignment in terms of the LLE outcomes, the BRICS community best practice will contribute to the efforts of advancing technology and collaboration with the BRICS community. But what is critical is a data-driven approach and integration information that will provide a critical step forward. The importance of data hubs and early warning systems is there. I think the most important here is how to collaborate and bring everything together into one system and single database so that we can report data when we want to report data. While technology cannot replace the vital resources people need in disaster, food, water, shelter, or comfort from loved ones, it's a transforming the disaster relief efforts and paving the way for an evolving approach to international aid, one that can reach more people faster and help communities to develop resilience for when the next disaster strikes. I think that technology will provide, artificial intelligence and big data will provide the next real critical success factor to take systems into the next level. And I think we have to bring this together and ensure that our data management processes is prerequisite. Thank you so much.
Thanks very, very, very much, Abdul, and the whole issue of how we collect data and how we get it useful, in particular linking it back to the previous presentation with multi-hazard and early warnings where people, the vulnerable, are also included. We don't leave anyone behind, is the mantra of the SDGs, and I think that's critical. So Abdul, thank you very, very much. That was fascinating. I've now been told we're playing musical chairs, I believe, but I just want to check that now we can go back to just sitting. Is that correct? Correct. We can go back to sitting. Okay, so then you may stay seated. I'd like to introduce the next presentation by Ms. Shwari Ramahofo. She is an engineer. She's professionally registered with the Engineering Society with more than 15 years experience in the energy sector. She serves as the Engineering Council of South Africa, and she has a vast amount of knowledge and experience. So it's not just data we need, we're also needing some of these other useful infrastructures or resilient infrastructures where we can use that data. So I hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Like Prof said, I'm from Engineering Council of South Africa, that is EXA. And maybe let me just abreast you in terms of how EXA is mandated. We are mandated by the Engineering Profession Act 46 of 2000. So the mandate of EXA really is to make sure that we accredit engineering programs, also registration of competent engineering practitioners, and also regulation of the engineering profession. And in terms of what has been said by various speakers this morning, as EXA, we are also aligned to say that we are for building forward. We believe in spending a bit more time in coming up with preventative measures rather than being reactive all the time, or maybe being less reactive, you know. And we're seeing that there's a serious need to ensure that infrastructure is initially and designed thematically so that we can reduce these major disasters. And from the Engineering Profession Act, we are really aimed at promoting safety and health and interest of the public. And some of the things that we believe that can really assist us in terms of designing resilient infrastructure is to make sure that the designs and building standards are not compromised. We're following our acts and legislatives, and also that we're producing as engineers quality work, you know, through various inspections of our infrastructure at different life cycle of the infrastructures, And also to make sure that only competent people execute engineering work and construction. And also that professionals are held accountable, especially for improper conduct and also for some of the shady works that become into disasters later. And we also believe that there's a broader discussion that we must get into around liabilities and also insurances. We must hold some of these engineers liable. And I think some of the learnings that we're getting from our BRICS countries, the first one is around compulsory registration, that it's compulsory. Like what we're doing with doctors, lawyers, we also need to make sure that we're getting into compulsory registration of practitioners that are in the engineering field. And some of the leading practices around that infrastructure that we are building must be adaptive and transformative in terms of they must overcome expected events and grow into unforeseen roles. And we must make sure that the infrastructures are environmentally integrated, that we must make sure that we are mitigating against climate changes. We're using this big data that we are speaking about, use the ecology data to predict and make decisions of your future infrastructure. And then also we must have continuous learning in terms of changing that planners can use and also for policymakers. But as engineers, we agree that there's a lot of role players that are needed, in terms of infrastructure building, but then engineers are the ones that must drive this agenda. And as engineers, we believe that we can build infrastructure and withstand stresses and disasters that are coming our way. We have some of our colleagues, our civil engineering colleagues, that have developed various leading innovation around structural reinforcement of buildings, and infrastructures. These are things that you can use. We're having a lot of antiqued buildings that can be reinforced before disaster strike. And in all our interests, it's all in our interest to make sure that we recover from disasters. But from engineers, we must make sure that we build infrastructure that will be able to absorb, react, and transform in terms of, in the events of disasters. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you very much. I'm dragging this around. No. Sorry about that. Thank you very, very much. That was really interesting. I thought particularly your point about compulsory registration for engineers. So we don't only have to have standardized data that we can use collectively and more systemically, but also thinking about our practices, how we regulate and try and cohere some of those so that we don't place people at risk and build in areas that maybe we shouldn't be building and using types of buildings that aren't safe. So moving along, it's now my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Anthea Stevens. Anthea Stevens is responsible for the climate and sustainability component of the City Support Program at the National Treasury, delivering support to 8 metros on disaster management, resilience, water resilience, et cetera, She spent over 2 decades designing and delivering some of these innovative ideas and bringing people together to talk about this. She's going to be talking to us about funding mechanisms, so that goes back to the previous question that was raised just before tea, for recovery and rehabilitation towards building back better. Over to you, Anthea.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Is my...
Yep.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks. So as the facilitator said, I'm talking about the funding and fiscal mechanisms. I'm going to touch on 2 main topics in my input. The first is going to be, how did we respond in terms of funding and fiscal response to COVID-19? What were some of the lessons that we drew from that? And then to move into South Africa's broader approach to funding disaster response and disaster management. And what are some of the priorities that we need to move on to strengthen our ability to finance particularly disaster risk. So a few points just up front. South Africa has a very diversified and large economy, and that's quite important in terms of enabling us to absorb shocks. We're not a sort of single sector reliant economy. We've got some diversity that helps. We are, however, quite highly exposed to climate and other shocks, and that means that we need to look at how we strengthen our resilience, whether it's to infrastructure, whether it's making use of the data that's available, learning from other disasters, but also we need to strengthen our ability to finance disaster response. I think it's well known that we're one of the most unequal countries in the world, so we've got a hugely unequal population, and that does mean that when disasters strike, we've got a lot of people that we need to essentially ensure social relief gets to. We've also been experiencing significant compounding shocks over the last couple of years, and those shocks have significantly increased our debt to GDP ratio from what it was at about 57% in 2018 to now over 80% in 2021. So that has reduced our fiscal space to respond to disasters. So in COVID-19, I think very quickly South Africa launched a stimulus package to the value of about 500 million rand, which was about 10% of GDP. And that was one of the largest responses to COVID, particularly in the SADC community. The bulk of this response went to support to health, social protection, but also dealing with unemployment that resulted from the pandemic. A lot of that response also went into raising grants and looking at subsidies, credit guarantee, as well as job creation. The funding for that response primarily came from budget reprioritization, and I'll talk a little bit about the costs, the opportunity costs of using budget reprioritization as a mechanism for financing disaster risk. About 25% of that stimulus came from loans from the international finance institutions, and then another 25% came from adjustment budgets. So we're rather heavily reliant on the fiscus for financing disaster response, and that speaks a little bit to the question that came from the floor earlier, and the need to look at how we strengthen and expand the suite of instruments that we do use to finance disaster response. The stimulus package that we had and the funding that we were able to mobilize left a funding gap. The Solidarity Fund was another mechanism that I'm sure some here will remember that was an instrument to receive both private and public money to finance the response to COVID, the immediate response to COVID. It was seen as a stopgap measure that was in place very quickly before the cycle of budget reprioritization and adjustments could come through. So some of the early lessons from the funding to COVID was firstly that we do have a strong legislative, institutional, and financial framework in South Africa for disaster response and disaster risk management in general. But there are gaps and there's challenges that we face and there's opportunities to strengthen it. The first is to strengthen our approach to risk layering, and I'll talk a little bit more about that now, but that was a very significant lesson and it's something that we're advancing in the National Treasury. The second was the importance of diversifying our funding instruments, and this is necessary, as I said, to try and reduce the amount of impact on the fiscus, which in itself means that there's an opportunity cost in the diversion of funds away from social and economic investments that are needed and programmed already, and that has significant opportunity cost. And the second is to look at how we identify and make better use of transferring risk to instruments that are specifically designed to handle that risk without taking away funds from, as I said, the necessary social and economic investments. So South Africa, the National Treasury has undertaken something called a disaster risk financing diagnostic, which helped to identify where the strengths and where the weaknesses are and where the opportunities for improvement are of our response to financing disaster risk. And I'll talk a little bit about our approach to financing disaster risk. some of the findings from that disaster risk diagnostic, and then I'll end on a couple of the sort of headline recommendations. So the main funding for disaster response in South Africa comes from grants. We've got two sets of grants, the disaster relief and disaster recovery grant, which work at a provincial level. These are administered through the NDMC in consultation with Treasury, and these are specifically for post-disaster funding. There are a range of I think, appreciated opportunities for improving how those funds flow, but particularly the need to look for instruments and investments that enable investment in strengthening disaster preparedness, as opposed to waiting for the money that comes once a disaster has been declared. And there's a recognition that there's almost a perverse incentive there, because you'll hold back from investing in the necessary preparation, planning, mitigation activities, and wait for the funds that come once a disaster has been declared. So there is a need to recognize that we need incentives in the system that strengthen investment in preparation. So essentially there's three main pillars to South Africa's approach to financing disaster response. The first is this risk layering strategy, which I'll speak to. The second is the fact that we do have a strong, diverse economy. And the third, which should be recognized and appreciated, is that we actually have a transparent and open approach to budget preparation. So, you know, we involve citizens in our approach to budget preparation. So let me talk a little bit about risk layering. And this is an approach where we start with the most high frequency and low impact shocks. And we end with the low frequency and high impact shocks. So the suite of mechanisms or financing instruments that we have for shocks that come round on a more regular basis. So, you know, more regular floods, more regular droughts. Here we have on-budget mechanisms. So reprioritization from budget, the adjustment budgets, amendment of cash flows, amendment of the grant frameworks. These are mechanisms that are used more regularly for events that have a lower cost. We then have our disaster grants, which require disaster classification and declaration. So we're moving up the sort of hierarchy of, you know, administrative onerousness. We then have the contingency reserve, which is managed by the National Treasury, and it is a mechanism for making contingency finance available. We've had the Solidarity Fund, which I've spoken about. We have insurance, which now we're starting to look at how we transfer risk off the fiscus. So household insurance, municipal asset insurance, and then lastly, at the sort of top, for the very low frequency, high impact events, we have international loans. So the disaster risk financing diagnostic took a look at all these various layers of our risk financing strategy and looked at what we use for what and how effective that is. And one of the key findings were that, firstly, there's a very substantial funding gap between the available funds that we have for disasters and the annual cost of disaster response. So for the average size of the disasters, when we did these calculations, we have funds available of about 1.4 billion rand. This leaves a funding gap of about 2.3 billion rand if we're looking at the average annual cost of disaster response being at 3.7 billion. So there's a significant funding gap. And with that, if we're needing to look at budget reprioritization and budget adjustments, that means that funds that are otherwise allocated towards, you know, funding energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, et cetera, those funds need to be reprioritized to disaster response and recovery.
Anthea, could you start wrapping up?
Sure, I'll get there now. We also have, there's a need to expand the risk finance instruments that we have. And it was recognized in the diagnostic that we did that there's actually savings to be made if we look at expanding the risk finance instruments. And in particular, insurance is an instrument that we don't make effective use of. So particularly for small-scale farmers, particularly for low-income households, there's a strong need to look at how we make sure that we've got insurance products that are targeted at the uninsured in South Africa. So my last point will just be to touch on some of the key recommendations from the disaster risk financing diagnostic. And these are being taken forward by National Treasury. So the first was that we actually need at a national level to develop a disaster risk financing strategy. And that work is already underway. And there should be an announcement on that coming up in the midterm budget policy statement. We need to look at addressing some of our emergency procurement provisions for much more efficient and streamlined emergency procurement, as well as making sure that we're making use of the emergency procurement provisions that are available. There is a need to look at how the budget mobilization for the disaster grants work. We find that it's not as efficient. The money doesn't come through as effectively and efficiently as it's needed when the disaster grants come through. And there's a significant need at various spheres of government, and I think Anne spoke to it around the capacity for disaster management centers, but to look at strengthening capacity in spheres of government to be able to work the funding systems for disaster response. And then the last point that I wanted to speak to was around the need to address the market failure, particularly in insurance for those low-income households and agricultural sector. I'll leave it there, thanks.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. Let's give Anthea a round of applause. So this panel has really been inspiring. I mean, we are really starting to get our heads around things that we really have been needing to get our heads around for quite some time. It's last but not least on the South African side, before we turn to our BRICS colleagues, I'd now like to introduce Dr. Annette Griesel. She is the Deputy Director General responsible for National Planning Coordination in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. She looks at particularly the government-wide planning system and the interfacing of policy and legislation. And she's going to talk about that integration and what it really means. And then we'll go across to our BRICS colleagues to include them as well in this very interesting discussion. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Colleen. Can you hear me? Yep. All right. Thank you again for this opportunity. Very exciting to be in the presence of all our delegates, as well as including the delegates from the BRICS countries. I'm going to focus on the National Development Planning System, and on the one hand, but also critically is the issue of the integration of the climate agenda and disaster planning within this planning system. Just by way of context, briefly, next year, 2024, marks the 30th year of our democracy. So it's an important milestone for us, and I think in a nutshell, whilst we have made important progress in improving the quality of life of our citizenry, we do continue to suffer from extremely high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Now, these suboptimal development outcomes have been exacerbated, and a number of speakers have spoken about this, the compounding effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, flood disasters and other disasters, social unrest, and other shocks. So the whole issue of socioeconomic recovery is a critical focus for us as a country. One of the DGs spoke earlier about the Economic Reconstruction Recovery Plan, which remains very, very critical. Now, just a few statements around the planning system. And it goes without saying, it might sound obvious, but that the National Development Planning System is integral to socioeconomic recovery and the achievement of our development goals as a country. But secondly, the effectiveness of the national planning system impacts on our ability to prevent and effectively respond to disasters, including the climate-related disasters, the man-made disasters. But also, for us as South Africa, one of our top priorities is the building of a capable developmental state. This is a key pillar of our long-term plan, the National Development Plan 2030. And we argue that development planning and the entire disaster management planning system are indeed integral to this very conceptualization of this capable developmental state. Now, just quickly, our planning system is multifaceted and includes long, medium, and short-term plans. The long-term plan is also aligned with the SDGs and the African Union Agenda 2063. Our medium-term plan sets out 7 priority areas which are based on the electoral mandate, but also give effect to the long-term plan. This alignment is very important because everyone agrees long-term planning is very important, but if you have a long-term plan, but it isn't translated into your medium and short-term plans, then there's no value in having a long-term plan, arguably. So we have 7 priority areas. I'll just quickly run through them. Firstly, building a capable, ethical, and developmental state, economic transformation and job creation, education, skills, and health. So the next session after this one is also within our priority areas, consolidating the social wage. So in a country with high unemployment, the social wage, as we call it, is very, very critical, but also issues of spatial integration, human settlements, and local government. We inherited a very unjust spatial development patterns, and part of our transformation imperatives is to change that those spatial patterns. Social cohesion and safer communities, and then last but not least, building a better Africa and a better world. So even today's session is part of giving effect to that pillar 7. We also, in addition to these national plans, we also have sub-national plans and municipal level plans. And I spoke earlier today about the district development model, which is very, very important. The district development model 1 plans are supposed to bring together all of government and all of society to drive development within a particular district space. And mainstreaming disaster risk reduction and disaster management at that district level is very, very important. I want to just quickly now touch on some of the challenges and opportunities. We had also done a detailed diagnostic on this, on planning at a national provincial level with a very good sample, and that gave us a lot of insight. So we have made a lot of progress in institutionalizing planning, but some of the challenges include that the system is still fragmented. So, even though you have a national planning system at a conceptual level, in reality, it's not always appropriately aligned. And also, the budgets are not adequately aligned in many instances. There's inadequate prioritization. So, particularly in a country such as ours, where you have a huge number of development challenges, the risk is that you just identify a long shopping list of things that need to be done, and that then stretches the capacity and the budgets. But I think one of the lessons from the various disasters, not just COVID, but the floods as well, is that some of our planning methodologies are outdated. Somebody spoke earlier about traditional approach to planning, where it's very rigid and linear, and you plan in advance, and that becomes, we have to be a lot more agile, flexible, and I'm sure many of you have heard about the term VUCA, that our planning system needs to be able to respond to volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So we need to shift from these simple linear approaches to more iterative, flexible, and adaptive approaches. And that's applicable equally at a strategic planning, development planning level, but also in the context of disaster management planning. We also, I think, and we've heard that one of the challenges is that there's inadequate disaster management planning. Dr. Satori spoke about this earlier, but also inadequate mainstreaming, not just of disaster risk reduction, but the broader climate agenda within the institutional planning and the broader planning system. Because we have regulated institutional plans of all our government departments. If you get key activities and targets into those plans, there's also much greater oversight by Parliament, by all the oversight bodies and so on. So that's quite an important strategy. The flood disaster also pointed to systemic problems, you know, and I think this has also been raised, you know, issues of inadequate urban management, settlements below the flood lines. For example, in the Northwest, that was also, Northwest province also affected by floods. You have entire settlements literally, you know, building below the flood lines. So they constantly get flooded. Poor enforcement of bylaws, land invasions, you know, it's not always even a problem with spatial planning, but a lack of enforcement of the actual spatial plans. We then come to the issue of some of the opportunities. We have introduced new policy and legislation to harmonize planning system. We have a budget prioritization framework, which is developed by DPME in the presidency in consultation with the whole of government, to say, you know, to guide the budget allocations and the issues around climate change is important there. Our 2024 budget prioritization framework actually focuses on stabilization, recovery, and reconstruction efforts. We've spoken about huge opportunity to improve mainstreaming of the just transition framework within the broader planning system. And then, of course, modernizing the planning system. Scenario planning, we've spoken about scenario. We've done scenario planning before, country level scenario planning. And we're doing that again. We've got something called Indlela Miti 2035, which we will, but the issue is it's no good to just do scenario planning without saying, well, so what? How do we actively influence the future scenarios, you know, issues of modeling, automation of planning systems. My colleague spoke about that. So in conclusion, we do need a paradigm shift. Somebody also spoke about that earlier. With regard to the broader climate agenda, improving capacity and capabilities around disaster management planning, but also it's very important and valuable for BRICS countries to continue to share lessons and good practice on planning systems, including disaster management planning. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Annette. Thank you very, very much. Also, before we forget, I just want us all to put our hands together for these wonderful signers who have been helping us here. So can we just... Thank you so much. We do now want to turn to our colleagues from BRICS, and we're really grateful that they are present. I hope I pronounce your names correctly. If I don't, please, I apologize. We have Mr. Olog Manulia, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, the Director for Civil Defense and Population Protection Report, Strengthening Socioeconomic Recovery, and he's going to give us some insights that link to some of the issues that we've been raising on this panel. Over to you. Thank you so much. Yes.
Уважаемые коллеги, добрый день. Экономика стран БРИКС, как и многие другие, в 2020 году столкнулась с проблемами, вызванными пандемией коронавируса, которая привела к нестабильности и неопределенности. Значительное замедление темпа роста из-за ковид затронуло все сферы деятельности, в том числе социальную и экономическую. Существенно возросла на них нагрузка, в том числе и на систему здравоохранения. При этом пандемия показала нам, что любой вызов таит в себе не только опасности, но и колоссальные возможности. В России необходимость реагирования национальной системы здравоохранения привели к формированию гибкой системы управления медицинскими ресурсами, масштабному внедрению цифровых инструментов, которая в дальнейшем была трансформирована и в других сферах. Были разработаны различные варианты формирования инфекционных госпиталей, в том числе и быстро возводимых. Пандемия COVID-19 ясно показала, что для выживания человечеству необходимо управление, координация и развитие. Единые подходы к профилактике, лечению и медицинской реабилитации позволили в кратчайшие сроки подготовить свыше 1,5 миллиона медицинских специалистов инфекционного профиля. Страны БРИКС реализуют ряд совместных инициатив, затрагивающие как профилактику, так и раннее обнаружение биологических и инфекционных угроз и адекватно реагируют на них. Так именно, на пространстве БРИКС были разработаны первые вакцины против коронавирусной инфекции и запущено их массовое производство. В России это позволило достичь высокого уровня вакцинации населения, что способствовало снижению госпитализации и летальных исходов. Деятельность по обмену штаммами различных инфекционных агентов сподвигла к созданию в марте 2022 года Центра БРИКС по исследованию и разработке вакцин. Всемирную поддержку этому центру выразили главы государств и правительств БРИКС. Как поддержание правильности выбранного вектора развития, хочу привести пример совместной работы российских и южноафриканских специалистов в декабре 2021 года. По решению президентов обеих стран в Южноафриканской республике отработала группа российских специалистов. В результате коллективного анализа биологических свойств омикрона и его клинических проявлений российской стороной были выработаны дополнительно профилактические меры и предусмотрены лечебные мероприятия для целевых групп граждан. Такая совместная работа доказала жизнеспособность и актуальность предложенной Россией и поддержанной всеми странами БРИКС комплексной системы раннего предупреждения рисков возникновения массовых инфекционных заболеваний. В рамках укрепления социально-экономического восстановления после пандемии одним из форматов сотрудничества стран БРИКС должна явиться совместная деятельность в различных сферах, в том числе в вопросах ликвидации последствий пандемий и чрезвычайных ситуаций. Основное внимание необходимо уделять следующим направлениям. Это проведение эффективной координации между странами-участниками БРИКС, международными и неправительственными организациями в целях укрепления социально-экономического восстановления после пандемии, возобновления экономической активности и связи между странами, а также их университетами и научными школами, функционирование нового банка развития, учрежденного странами БРИКС, установление новых межгосударственных связей во всех сферах деятельности с учетом влияния санкционной политики недружественных стран, развитие фармацевтической отрасли и систем здравоохранения с учетом опыта борьбы с ковид. Еще одним ключевым аспектом сокращения глобальных потерь является финансовая стабильность, а также борьба с инфляцией, поддержка курса национальной валюты. Медицинский и экономический кризис с 2020 года нанес тяжелый удар по глобализации, но без международного взаимодействия мировая экономика не сможет преодолеть наступивший процесс стагнации. На последнем 15-м саммите БРИКС обсуждались темы отказа от доллара и перехода на расчеты в национальных валютах. За прошедшее десятилетие инвестиции государств БРИКС в глобальную экономику выросли вдвое, а совокупный экспорт достиг 20% от общего мирового показателя. Успешно реализуется стратегия экономического партнерства стран БРИКС. Развивается цифровая экономика, поддержка малых и средних предприятий, справедливый трансфер технологий, применение искусственного интеллекта. Экономика стран БРИКС возвращается на траекторию устойчивого восстановления. Несмотря на подъемы и спады, продолжают расти добыча полезных ископаемых, обрабатывающая промышленность, внешняя торговля и инвестиции. Так, объем взаимной торговли между Китаем и Россией увеличился и в 2022 году достиг 190 миллиардов долларов. За последние 2 года Россия стремительно переместилась с 25-го на 7-е место среди торговых партнеров Индии. Объем торговли между Бразилией и Россией к концу 2022 года достиг рекордной отметки – около 10 миллиардов долларов, а двусторонний товарооборот с Южноафриканской Республикой увеличился на 16,4%. Уважаемые коллеги, обеспечение сотрудничества стран БРИКС в различных сферах оказывает большое влияние на развитие их экономик. Но и наибольшее значение имеет уже достигнутый прогресс в области информационных и биотехнологий, медицины, авиации, космоса, вооружений и многих других, которые влияют не только на все направления их деятельности, но и способствуют обеспечению устойчивого развития и безопасности стран. В завершение хочу поблагодарить вас за приглашение принять участие в заседании рабочей группы БРИКС. Отношения с партнерами БРИКС имеют важное значение. Вместе всегда легче преодолевать трудности, и нам крайне важна ваша поддержка. Хочу отметить, что мы всегда рады делиться с коллегами имеющимся опытом и заинтересованы в продолжении и наращивании нашего сотрудничества в области предупреждения и ликвидации чрезвычайных ситуаций. Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much. Lots of interesting synergies there in terms of medicines, technologies, data, etc., and how we can work as BRICS countries. So thank you very, very, very much. I'd now like to invite Ms. Yun Yi, who is the Deputy Director General, Department of Risk Monitoring and Integrated Disaster Risk Reduction. Please come forward. Thank you.
大家好。那么刚才南非相关的机构专家还有俄罗斯的代表呢，都做了很好的一个演讲。那么我也针对刚才几位专家的这个演讲这个题目呢，做一些回应，介绍一下中国的相关的一些做法。关于这个灾害的这个动态的这个监测和这个早期预警呢，中国呢一直就非常的重视，也作为减少这个人员伤亡和财产损失的一个非常的这个关键的这个举措来去做。那么我们呢，现在针对这个气象灾害、水旱灾害、地震、地质灾害、海洋灾害，还有这个森林草原火灾呢，就是这些都是影响中国的主要灾害呢，已经构建起了较为完备的这个单灾种和单要素的这个监测战网这个体系。那么当一个比较大的这个灾害发生之后呢，我们还会对这个监测呢进行这种加密，减少它这个监测的这个时间的这个周期和这个在空间上呢更加精细化。 那么在监测的基础上呢，我们加强这个预警工作。那么建立了国家预警信息发布中心，当然在省市县各级也都有相应的这个预警信息发布中心。那么我们现在预警信息这个送达到这个最基层呢，已经可以这个时间是比较短的，然后这个信息覆盖率能够达到90%以上。在这个单灾种单要素的这个监测预警的这个基础上呢，我们强化，刚才也有南非专家提到，就我们强化多灾种多类型的信息的这种汇聚，那么加强多种信息的这个综合研判，来更好的为这个早期预警和响应呢做出这个判断。同时呢，我们也是在单灾种的这种，他们做的更多的是这种气象的天气的这种发展的一个情况，我们也正在往这个灾害所有可能造成的这损失的一个影响，来进行这个综合研判，为更好的这个支撑这个我们早期预警和相关的备灾和抢险救援工作呢，提供这个基础。那么在这个早期预警这个工作的基础上呢，我们进一步强化这个早期的一个行动。那么我们建立这个早期预警与应急响应的联动机制。当我们的这个预警信息发出来之后，实际上作为我们行动响应的这个发令枪，来加强这个相关的这个救援力量、物资装备的这种调运，还有我们这个包括恢复重建的全方位准备。在必要的时候呢，采取这个停工停学，这个包括停止一些这个交通的一些这个运行呢，来确保我们这个人民财产的这个人民生命财产的这个安全。那么现在呢，我们强化这个也是在特别是在基层，让他们能够早发现这个隐患，早对高风险地区的人员呢进行这个转移避险，这是我们能够最大限度减少人员伤亡的非常重要的一个措施。在这个方面呢，我们也在社会上加强这个宣传，我们挖掘非常成功的这种案例呢，做好宣传，帮助基层呢更好的有这个防灾避险的意识，也是帮助基层呢能够更好的这个早行动起来。这是关于这个早期预警、早期行动方面的。第二个方面呢，就是关于刚才几位专家提到的这个恢复重建这个工作。恢复重建这块儿之后呢，就是强化基础设施的恢复和建设呢，确实是非常重要的一个方面。那么我们主要是有2个阶段，第一呢就是这个基础设施的早期恢复。那么我们在这个灾害发生之后呢，实际上还是以人为本，那么以这个最大程度的这个改善民生呢，作为恢复重建的基本出发点。一呢是保证我们这个受灾群众呢，能够在这个基本生活呢，在12个小时之内呢就能够就是基本生活能够得到有效的一个保障，同时呢优先恢复重建这个我们的受灾群众的，比如住房、学校、医院的公共设施，包括我们这个紧急恢复像交通、供电、这个供水还有通讯等基础设施这种紧急的这种恢复。第2个阶段呢，实际上在灾后这个灾害发生之后呢，就是这个整个灾害过程结束之后呢，我们注重这个重建的这种科学规划，我们加强这个顶层设计，多部门联合起来呢，来做好这个特别是基础设施的这个恢复重建，能够符合灾区的一个实际情况，也是为了灾区未来更好的发展呢，做好这个恢复重建的这个基础设施的恢复重建工作。那么在恢复重建的这个资金的这个整合投入方面呢，确实我们这几年发生几个 一些这个大灾之后呢，我们强化就是多渠道资金的这种投入，包括这个这个国家和地方资金的财政资金的一个投入，也包括国内外的这种贷款啊、金融手段，还有我们中国比较特色的就是我们不同区域内的不同区域。
Malinda man. Yo. That's right.
Thank you.